Sure. So I'm Emma Brolia. I recently finished and passed my PhD. My PhD evaluated the effectiveness of student mental health services embedded within higher education across the UK. I was based at the University of Sheffield, but a lot of our work, as Sam said, was sort of embedded into practice. So we engaged with a number of different student counselling services across the UK. And although I didn't intend to look at personal tutoring as part of my PhD, it came up quite a lot. So a lot of the people that I was engaging with, whether it was students being seen by therapists in the counselling service, whether it was personal tutors that I was working with when I was teaching, it kept on coming up that students are more and more going to their personal tutors to talk about student mental health. So when this project came about, I was definitely sure that I wanted to get on and get involved. So I'm very excited to be here.
Brilliant. So getting personal, exploring the potential of personal tutoring to remedy attainment gaps. And this is where we're going to go through the overall ethos of the project. So the RARA project is a coalition, diverse coalition of universities dedicated to closing their attainment gaps and sharing best practice. What we have here is we have three very different institutions. You've got King's in London, who is a Russell Group, but a metropolitan Russell Group. You've got Sheffield, who is a Yorkshire campus-based sort of singular institution, all in one area. And you've got the University of Portsmouth, which is a newer university. Each partner in that project is committing to pilot a way of doing personal tutoring in a particular faculty, to learn from that and hopefully to scale it up and generate from that research. So at Sheffield, we have the Faculty of Engineering. At the University of Portsmouth, we have the Faculty of Creative and Cultural Industries. And then at King's College London, we've got the Dental Institute. And really, the way we came to join this up is to go through a little bit of the logic model of the project, the theory behind it, is that we know that we have an attainment gap at those institutions. At Sheffield, it's 10% institutionally, that's echoed in the Faculty of Engineering. We know that that attainment gap is controlled for prior attainment. So it is something that is happening when students come into the institution. This is a BME student and a white student being compared from similar backgrounds with similar grade profiles, similar tariff on entry points, and that when they actually arrive, there is in principle no reason why they should not be capable of getting a first-class degree on paper. And so this is where, when we know that that gap is there, it's suggesting that it's something that happens once they're at university. Now, access widening participation in terms of encouraging entry into university is very important. But one of the things that the graph shows here was one of the key questions we had when discussing this gap was, is the gap in some way remedied by improving access? And therefore, should we be looking at increasing the diversity of our institution, which is absolutely something I support. But if you look at this graph, you'll see that there isn't actually a correlation. If you look at the attainment gaps going up the side and the diversity of the institution, there isn't actually a relationship between the size of the gap and the diversity of the student body per se. So while access is important, it is not something, the attainment gap is not something which will be remedied in itself by just increasing the access of students from certain backgrounds. And therefore, this was what started us thinking that actually we needed to go a little bit deeper, that this was about the quality of the pedagogical relationships once students enter institutions, the sense to which they belong, matter, and then we started to do a little bit of a literature review to position the problem, which was what can make a difference. So we know that pedagogical relationships are deeply and profoundly shaped by inequalities of race and gender. We know that to impact BME students, students need to feel empowered to sort of have power-sharing relationships with staff. So this was where we start to foreground this idea that there's a relationship pattern there, that the tutoring relationship might be an interesting place to explore. We've seen from some of the What Works research that students prefer pastoral support being delivered by academics. And also this starts to emerge a sort of logic here that if we know that these students have the same attainment on entry, this isn't necessarily a problem that we're going to fix if we just purely look at the idea of tapping that data a little bit more, finding the gap, putting on extra skills, doing something other. It's something that we need to explore the relationship that we have with students as it develops. And that we know that students' positive relationships within the institution can influence outcomes, that staff have the potential to be agents of change, and that there's something important there about the struggle that students have sometimes to learn the rules of the HE game when they come into the institution. And this was where we started to think, why personal tutoring? Because actually personal tutoring is something that nearly every institution, I'm only aware of one that's removed it and made it into student services, professional services function, does in higher education across the sector. We know from the work that Alison was doing and some of the reading around the relationships of personal tutoring that personal tutors have a powerful role to be interlocutors, to help students feel that there's someone on their course who knows them and is looking out for them in the following ways, and that has the potential to influence the extent to which students feel like they belong at the institution, that they're entitled to be there, that the sites of some of these power-sharing relationships and the areas in which staff can act as agents of change are there. And we're not saying that there's necessarily a relationship here that's saying poor personal tutoring equals an attainment gap. But what we are saying in sort of foreground in this project is that if we're already doing something which in theory meets sort of like some of the aspects and starts to have a correlation with factors that are contributing towards the attainment gap, surely we should deconstruct what we're already doing and see how it could be better before we start doing something else. Before almost we position this as a bit of a deficit discourse where we go, these students have a problem and therefore we should silo them off into another form of work or something like that. And here we sort of see the pattern as to why we would look at personal tutoring, why we think personal tutoring can make a difference. And really one of the problems that we had, therefore, was trying to think about how we would put a bid where we're being tasked with the challenge of scaling up an intervention like personal tutoring, scaling up a way of doing it. And the reason we have the Paddington slide is I tried to depoliticise the conversation of scaling up, because when we're scaling up, the thing that people automatically go to is they automatically go to a sort of production line. And so here we've got Paddington making marmalade. So the idea here is that we've got Paddington out in the forest with his aunt making marmalade on a very small cottage industry scale. He's then moving up to sort of like a smaller local village production line, and he's building his marmalade production for a household of people. And then as you go into Paddington 2, he is basically feeding an entire prison on marmalade. And that's the kind of things where in this production model there are common features, there are core things, there's a recipe, there's a formula that can be scaled up, there's tools that can be scaled up. And I think one of the things that we had instead was the idea that actually a process-driven scale-up model wouldn't necessarily work for something like this. And this is part of the rah-rah ethos, that actually what we're scaling up is principles, that we're trying through this project to develop an approach around an agreed set of principles, hypotheses. Each institution might have structural similarities, so the way in which we're developing our personal tutoring initiative is that each institution includes an online platform, each institution includes a CPD training package within that pilot faculty. Each institution includes a policy, sort of, buy-in and literature around it. But actually those things aren't always the same. So in presenting the sort of work that we're doing here, we're not giving you a how-to, we're giving you a sort of ethos that we're asking you to copy, and very much and emulate, but in a way that works for you. And it allows freedom to respond to our own unique context, so structures, as we talked about that microcosm of the institutions, barriers, drivers, but always returning to the key principles and hypotheses to justify the actions and the thinking. And must be supported by robust evaluation to make sure it is not just anecdotal evidence about what we think can make a difference, but we're actually trying to prove the difference. And why? Well, we go back to that set of things that we learnt in the literature when we were positioning why personal tutoring might help the problem. Social inequalities cannot be tracked didactically. What works for Sheffield will not automatically work for King's, will not automatically work for Portsmouth, and will not automatically work for all of the institutions that are here today. Buy-in and ownership is required. If we don't build buy-in and ownership, how are we going to work on empowering students and empowering staff in those relationships and in those dynamics? And to overcome attainment gaps, as we've already seen, staff need to act as agents of change, feel empowered to be agents of change, and they need to build up relationships with students. And this is not something that we can necessarily resolve in a one-size-fits-all model. And here are some of the key principles, which I'm actually going to skirt over a little bit, because I know Alison's going to talk about them a little bit in her paper, and that it's kind of feeding through in terms of actually these are some of the core principles that we've all agreed, merging our different pieces of practice that we're starting to emulate in our policy. And it's about positioning the activity of personal tutoring as mainstream, being governed by a code of practice, having ownership within the institution, senior leadership, and that it's engaged, accessible champions. So you look at some of the work that we're doing around the badge campaign, the pledge campaign, and we're trying to champion and raise awareness of the personal tutoring and the value that we're putting into personal tutoring. And so I think this is Emma. Key hypotheses. So these are also some of the key hypotheses that we're actually going to measure against those principles and as part of that strategy. So the overarching one, as we talked about before, is that good personal tutoring provision, incorporating an online platform, a CPD and a policy intercourse will improve engagement in personal tutoring, which can make a contribution to raising attainment. We see here some of the hypotheses that people are probably going to tease out throughout the day in some of their talks and some of the other projects and aspects of evaluation, but that a student's sense of mattering and belonging at university can affect attainment, and that personal tutoring has the potential to improve that. That having an overt point of access through personal tutoring creates the space for a student to seek help and can have a positive impact on their attainment. By having a systematic approach to personal tutoring, staff and students should feel clear about and empowered by their rights and responsibilities in that relationship. And also that there is an important role there for educational mentors in addressing and remedying some of those attainment gaps.
So in terms of some of the ways in which we're trying to understand impact, we're using our evaluation strategy to monitor changes in awareness and the provision of personal tutoring throughout the course of the RARA project. So the overall purpose of this is that it's, as Sam explained, it's very much informed by some key hypotheses that he just went through. We've used a mixed methods design because we want to make sure that we're incorporating both the perspectives of students and staff, the thing that we are researching, but whilst also backing it up with some data that comes from the institution as well. And so by doing this, the three phases that we've split the project into, we've got a before phase, so before RARA sort of existed, a during phase, what's happening whilst we're making these little changes, and then what happens after. So these are the three phases. So in each phase, we have a series of surveys and focus groups with students and staff, and in our baseline phase, we wanted to extend our before phase a little bit more by talking to recent graduates. So we've got an alumni survey that went out, and then we've repeated that in our during phase, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. And we've got our after phase, which reflects on what we've learned and what's different to the surveys with the students in the after phase compared to the surveys of the students in the before phase. And we've basically mirrored the before and the after phase to see, almost like bookends around the project, what has changed whilst we've been making these little differences. We're currently in the during phase. We're actually towards the end of the during phase because we're on track. And what we've done with the during phase is that we thought we wanted to do something a bit more different. And we're asking students and staff to reflect on the findings that we had from the before phase. So sometimes this has involved engaging with students and staff that we already met with in the first phase, but sometimes it's also involved engaging with more students and more staff and presenting them the findings that we found from the before phase. So say, well, this is what we found. These are some contrasting findings. What's your opinion on this? How does this relate to your experience? As well as doing these sort of new data collection activities, we're also exporting the last 5 years of academic attainment data, and actually all institutions got the data to me yesterday, so I'm going to be spending a lot of my time analysing that. With the idea being that we want to understand what's been happening to the attainment gap in the faculties that we're exploring across the different institutions. So the overarching question with that is what's been happening to the gap, but more interestingly, we want to know when it manifests, if there's a key time at which it manifests, and how that corresponds to some of these focus groups and interviews that we're doing with students and staff. So is there a critical time, for example, where we can potentially make a difference? Sam also mentioned the personal tutoring system. We've got 3 slightly different systems working at each 3 of the institutions, and that again gives us some data in terms of engagement. So in terms of seeing changes throughout the project, do we see a change in engagement in terms of how students and staff are engaged with this personal tutoring platform? So we thought this is one of the findings that we've been using in our during phase to give back to students and staff to see what their take is on it. So this is a survey with personal tutors from the 3 faculties that we've been looking at. And we just asked them a series of questions about whether they feel valued by their institution, whether they value personal tutoring as part of their role of being an academic, and whether they get personal satisfaction. We put in a question there around career progression, not because we necessarily thought personal tutors thought it would contribute to it towards their career, but because it's something that's come up quite early on, where there seems to be inconsistent assumptions between students and staff as to whether personal tutoring contributes to career progression. What we can see here, so we've got our dark pink bars in the agree, and we can see that personal tutors feel like personal tutoring is valued by the institution, and they feel like it is a valuable part of their role. If we skip down here, we find that they find both professional and personal satisfaction for being personal tutors. But when we come to career progression, we've got the opposite effect. They're sort of saying, well, I don't do it for career progression. I do it because I enjoy it. I do it for all these reasons and because it's an integral part of my role. But what's interesting is that when we've given these findings back to students, they are really surprised by this because they've just had an assumption that they think, well, why wouldn't they do it if they're not going to personally benefit from it? So that's been one of the many really interesting things that we're getting from the during phase by reflecting these findings back to the students and staff. And then the second question that I just wanted to talk about today is awareness of attainment gaps. So of course, we want to measure awareness of attainment gaps, not only for BME students, but for students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And so again, these are findings from the baseline staff survey, and we asked staff about their awareness of these gaps broadly. So these 2 down here are their awareness of attainment gaps for these 2 groups that we're looking at within the sector across universities. And again, dark pink being yes, a lot of them do seem to be quite aware that these gaps exist. When we then ask if they think that they exist in their faculty or in their department, there seems to be quite a bit difference there. So that's been quite interesting talking to staff in the during phase, because we've been sort of saying, well, this is what people say. There seems to be an awareness in the sector, but not an awareness in the faculty. Based on your experience, based on the people that you work with, based on the students that you engage with, do you think there's an attainment gap within the faculty that you're working in? And the during phase has really given us an opportunity to really hit the question head on and not give the opportunity for people to sort of give us vague answers. So it's been quite an interesting phase. But what's interesting on top of all of that is that personal tutors do think that there can be agents of change. So Sam's going to talk a little bit more about how we think these findings are interacting with one another.
Yeah, and how some of this sort of research and evaluation work we're doing can sort of start to embed into some of the training and development work that we're doing as well. So this was some of the work that came from the focus groups and interviews with staff at Sheffield, I think it was. And what we can see here is some very interesting quotes where we're starting to see what some of the issues will be and unpick some of those things. So there is a lack of awareness about what attainment gaps are. There's a sense that attainment gaps don't exist and almost an outright denial, which might be going back into some of those white privilege narratives that I was talking about at the start. And so you can see how we might start to then embed into being aware of that, something which is just like the pledge campaign, raising the literacy and raising the awareness of what the gaps actually are. Because this is about setting the culture that we want to have at Sheffield and at the institutions about making the gaps visible. What I do like to think about there, and I've positioned this and positioned the day as an opportunity to reflect, is what we are seeing though is one of the positives, is some good examples of staff reflecting on their practice and thinking about how they shape their practice around groups of students. However, what that is appearing when we do some of the research, and it's something which me and Jamie have talked about in terms of the training that we deliver in the Faculty of Engineering, is it's very limited to staff's own experience. So we've got a very good quote here which is talking about how this particular academic came from a working class background. They know what it's like to be a working class academic, and they're tailoring and thinking about the provisions. So that is the right mindset. And this goes back to when I theorise about some of the training that we've been doing with Jamie and some of the reflective activities that we're going to do and build more into our training, is to really go back to that, how do we develop a culture of equity and things like that. I bring in a little bit of theory, which is we need to move away a little bit from this sort of very didactic idea on the left, which is probably related more to Locke and Rawls for theorists, where recognition, redistribution, so for example creating spaces, admissions, access, bursaries, will automatically lead to greater equality and social justice and fairness. And instead think more about a sophisticated combination of a recognition, a cultural recognition of the students that should make up our institutions, as well as the material recognition work. And this is where we're starting to articulate that to staff in the training that we're doing as part of the awareness raising exercise. And this is some of the theory that I'm using to underpin some of my thinking in the work that we're doing in Sheffield. And you can see already from some of the quotes of students that there are evidence there of those disconnects. They're not being fabricated or imposed on by theory. It's this idea that if we just look at some of the quotes, sort of students not understanding the value, not feeling recognised, and sort of this quote in particular in the middle from a BME student is very interesting in terms of the culture of why we need to change some of those recognition and equity discourses, because there is here this place where students are being positioned as other, and that idea that just because they're here that it should be enough for them. And this is where we're starting to do some really deep, meaty work in the faculties with them. I'm aware that we've gone on. Emma, do you want to recap the conclusions?
Sure. So really quickly, we're experiencing that staff do feel valued and supported, and they certainly feel satisfaction in their role of being personal tutors, although it's not clear whether it contributes to their career at this point. Staff are aware of these attainment gaps for BME students and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds generally, but they're not sure how they position themselves in terms of acting as agents of change. Going forward, there is a utility to recognise theories of what the theories can be used, and the initial evidence starts to shape the risk recognition of the needs of the BME students and students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. So in terms of raising awareness and reconstituting the roles of the potential of the tutors to address these attainment gaps, and need to reflect on the complex of the constructions of these one-to-one relations.